Hello, this is Jim Schwab. I'm manager of the Hazards Planning Research Center for the American Planning Association, and we're here at the 2014 APA National Planning Conference in Atlanta. With me is Scott Davis from HUD. Scott has recently been the director of the Office of Recovery within the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and is now a senior advisor to the Office of the Secretary.
Correct.
So he's got deep experience. Before that, he was actually with FEMA for a while, back during Hurricane Katrina and afterwards.
Yep.
So he brings years of experience with this issue of disaster recovery. Scott, the place I'd like to start is that in the aftermath of Sandy, there have been some interesting discussions and innovations on the part of HUD, both in chairing, Secretary Donovan chairing this Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force, and in the goals of the HUD expenditures, which are substantial, for community development block grant disaster recovery funds. Could you tell us a little about what has been happening that is sort of changing the field of disaster recovery from HUD's perspective?
Right. Well, I would say that a large part of it is that the Secretary comes from local government, and he understands that all recovery is local and it hits the ground locally. That's where the rubber hits the road. And so capacity there is always an issue when you're talking about recovery of this magnitude and handling this volume of funding. It's like drinking from a fire hose for a lot of places. And so part of the challenge, what we're leaning forward on behalf of the government, is to try to do a much better job of coordinating all of our funding streams and programs and policies so that they're not drinking out of multiple fire hoses at the same time. And so that's really a large part of how the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force kind of functioned, but not just to help to coordinate federal investments and kind of subject matter expertise and everything else, but also to form a collective vision with local, state, and federal leaders in the region to establish a long-term rebuilding strategy and identify areas where we need to go in order to achieve a more sustainable, resilient recovery for the Sandy region.
Yeah, and that collective vision for the region is an interesting point because of the very geography of Sandy, where you've got this huge city, 8 million people, New York, where Sean Donovan comes from. You've got a plethora of small municipalities scattered across the rest of Long Island, and then a lot of very small towns up and down the coast in New Jersey, all of which give you a really widely varied region within which to work, but much of which has very similar problems.
Yes. I mean, it is widely varied in terms of scale and scope of jurisdictions, but
and capacity
and politically a very diverse region. But they all have one thing in common, and that's to rebuild their communities safer and stronger and quickly. And so that's the unifying theme, and it's amazing how much after a disaster that common goal kind of breaks down a lot of those barriers, and you're able to unify action at a level that you're often unable to do in non-disaster environments.
All you can say all the way up and down this New Jersey coast, you all have the same problem essentially.
Yes.
And one of the issues that has emerged, particularly from the Sandy Rebuilding Task Force, but also from other discussions in the region, is this issue of the role of green infrastructure for the future of that coast. Could you talk a little bit about that and HUD's role in trying to encourage that?
Sure. And so part of one of the outcomes and recommendations as part of the rebuilding strategy was a series of kind of resilience principles. And part of that is to look toward maximizing green infrastructure alternatives and options, and realizing that the solution is oftentimes a combination of green and gray, and we shouldn't depend entirely on one or the other, but to really explore how to maximize both approaches. And so working together with our other federal agencies, EPA and Department of Interior and Department of Energy and others, really looking at kind of where key opportunities are for these kind of strategic investments in green infrastructure. So we're really looking to maximize that. One of the major things coming out of a design competition that HUD has recently sponsored called Rebuild by Design has been a lot of the innovative ideas and project proposals for resilience coming out of that have included a lot of green infrastructure elements.
Yeah, I was in fact going to, if you didn't mention it, I was going to ask you to talk about Rebuild by Design and how that process is actually encouraging some innovation, because there's a big public participation component in that's often not part of design competitions, right?
Very, very, and that's one of the things. I mean, many things makes it unique, but is that we really wanted ideas not just that are good ideas, maybe that stand alone, that come out of a studio somewhere with a bunch of great thinkers and come out and present maybe a pretty proposal that can hang on a wall, but something that is actually implementable and feasible and viable, technically, politically feasible,
organic within the community.
Yes, absolutely. And so half of the competition really was very participatory and very outreach intensive. And because of that, it takes a longer time to do this. It was a 9-month competition, multiple phases, and it began with really understanding, having the design teams work with the communities to understand their needs and priorities and the interdependencies of systems there, and then work with them to kind of collectively, collaboratively develop design solutions that are appropriate for that place, and do that with kind of tacking back and forth with them strategically along the design path. And so the result is that it's been incredible. They've submitted dozens and dozens of letters of support accompanying each design proposal, from local stakeholders, local elected officials, all the way, from local nonprofit groups, all the way up to United States senators.
Sure.
And it's really, I think, done a tremendous job of forming the basis, so the community really themselves take over the project and are its own champion, and there's a foundation there for really to help implementation, and that's really critical.
Yeah, this is the first time you're doing this. Presumably it may not be the last. So where does that Rebuild by Design competition lead HUD in terms of this kind of engagement in future scenarios like Sandy, future disasters, future projects of this nature?
Well, I would say that, and not just limiting to disasters, it's a great innovative approach that's created some great feasible projects, and the transition from rebuild by design to build by design, necessarily, that it doesn't necessarily just have to happen post-disaster, but this is how we should be building all the time and incentivizing innovative ways to increase resilience in our cities before and after disasters. And so the challenge is to the model, of course, is that there are unique opportunities that come with post-disaster recovery, because it's an opportunity for large one-time investments.
Sure.
So Congress has appropriated a lot of funding to help communities rebuild, and we're able to kind of to match up some of those investments with the needs on the ground in innovative ways. In kind of non-disaster environments, finances are very stretched at the local, state, and federal level, but that doesn't mean that that the model can't be adapted to kind of right-size itself to the funding sources and sizes available.
Right. And disasters are not the only kind of stress that communities experience.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
Which leads me to the one final question I want to use to wrap this up. And I know that FEMA has worked a lot more on this particular piece of the puzzle, but it seems inevitable that sooner or later HUD will also be involved in this, because HUD comes as close as we have to a national planning agency. The question of, especially for the purpose of resilience, getting communities into the habit of actually doing pre-event planning, looking ahead to what would this recovery look like should an event occur. And part of that resilience is that it becomes an ongoing activity rather than a reactive activity, just waiting for an event to happen.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think that's critical, and that's a real an area where we all need to lean forward on moving forward, which is communities don't necessarily need to envision what their community will look like after a disaster, how they before. What they're doing, the pre-disaster planning for post-disaster recovery, is figuring out what the decision-making process is going to look like, so that they don't. You want to kind of assemble those structures and those relationships and identify those roles and responsibilities in peacetime rather than wartime.
So you can hit the ground running.
Absolutely, and that way everybody knows what everybody else is supposed to be doing, and that these joint coordination and decision-making structures, not just within the jurisdiction, but how that jurisdiction makes decisions with other jurisdictions, or the school board, or the sewer and water authority, or the transportation authority, and so that you start to think about recovery regionally, because disasters rarely hit just one, jurisdiction. Sometimes they do, but the large-scale disasters usually have impacts that extend far beyond one jurisdiction.
And understanding that a good bit of resilience is building those relationships so that things do function efficiently.
Yes, absolutely.